and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about recovering from a divorce. Now, this is a tough one because, unfortunately, quite a few marriages do end in divorce, about 43.5% in New Zealand. So in 2019, there were about 19,000 marriages and civil unions and about 8,300 divorces. So unfortunately, relationships do come to an end in some instances. And at that stage, you know, the average man divorces at about 47, the average woman about 45. We've got 20 years to retirement and we've got to build our assets back up because we're going to split them when that unfortunately happens. And so I wanted to talk about this on the show today. Funnily enough, it actually came from my partner, Kelly. She said, I'd love for you to talk about divorce. I said, I hope that's not you trying to say that it's going to happen.
She wants to know the next steps.
Well, you know, she's sensible, so she's planning for it. So I thought we'd talk about it on the show today. Now, my first question for you, Andrew, is though, is it the right time, or when is the right time to start thinking about building your assets back up and investing in property when you're going through a separation?
Well, it's a really challenging one because obviously a separation often there's a lot more going on than just the finances at that stage. You know, there might be kids involved. There's a lot of emotions running high. And if you are in a position where, you know, maybe the next 12 months isn't as certain with your partner as it once was, it's probably time to hit pause on your plan. This is a pretty real topic for me at the moment because I just finished working with an investor just this afternoon and I've worked with them for a while. They've got a bit of challenging time at the moment. And so, you know, they've got a position right now where they could buy more rental properties and that's probably the right thing to do. But given that there's just, you know, maybe not as much certainty in the relationship right now, my advice was, let's not do anything. Let's just tidy up kind of the finances, make sure that we've got access to money, those kind of things, rather than investing because, you know, you don't want to buy something only to have to sell it in a couple of years, trigger bright line test or just find it hard because it's, you know, the family home's tied up as a collateral on the investment loans.
Now, this is particularly poignant as well. We're just about to release the next issue of Juno Investing magazine, and on the cover of this, it's actually quite good if I can say this. I mean, hopefully you'd say that.
Magazine,
you'd hope would say that it was good. But we've got a board game in it. It's the game of life, essentially the Juno version of it. Now, what's interesting is when you land on the square where you get married, you move 8 steps forward. When you land on the square that you get divorced, you're moving 15 steps back. And I'm sure that it can feel that way, and certainly is that way when you've got to go from 2 incomes in one household to 2 incomes servicing separate households, you know, 1 income per household in that instance. And that's going to impact income and things that affect your ability to invest in property.
Yeah, it's interesting working with some of the investors that I've worked with who have come out of divorces and, you know, they might have sold the family home, maybe a couple of investments, and now they've got a lump of money in the bank and they don't really know what to do with it. And one lady springs to mind who's based in Auckland that I was working with last year, and it was always her husband that was involved in the property, pushing them to buy property. And so now she's renting a property, and I think she was listening to the podcast, might be listening now, and she just decided, actually, I'm just going to rent because I don't really know where I want to be over the next few years. And she didn't have someone to bounce the ideas off anymore. So working with a property partner was a good plan for her because of the fact that actually she needed someone to kind of push her to do something because otherwise this money would just sit in the bank. And, you know, anyone can end up in this position. You know, similarly, you can end up, you know, in the opposite situation where you don't have a lot afterwards. And so you really need to start making some decisions to build those assets back up. After the wallet biopsy, they call it.
Well, let's talk about how it impacts your ability to invest in property. So first of all, as we said, you've potentially got less income in the household, and a higher percentage of your income is likely to be going towards personal housing. And this is because, again, you've now got 1 income in each household rather than 2. Your childcare costs are potentially also going to increase, negatively impacting your ability to purchase investment properties because you've got less uncommitted monthly income each week because you don't have the 2 adults in the household. And if you're splitting all of your assets, you've also probably got less equity and maybe more of that tied up in your personal home if you both go out and both purchase now your own homes because you both need 20% in that.
Yeah, and it can also, obviously with the LVR restrictions coming in, it's not quite as simple as just selling a property and taking the equity out anymore. You might have to sell down properties at not an opportune time in the market, and so that's definitely something to consider. Not saying you should time your divorce with the property market, but obviously something to consider in that. But also, one positive, and actually this just came as a bit of a joking comment from one of the investors that I work with. She said, well, if I end up with a new partner, maybe he'll push me to actually do something. So, you can look at that as a positive as well. Maybe you get someone who is more complementary to your way of thinking.
Well, let's talk about the mental side, because that's probably one of the biggest areas that it's going to impact you. Now, I haven't been in that situation. Andrew, unfortunately, you have been through a separation. You wouldn't believe it, knowing your good looks and personality.
Yes, I have, amazingly enough. And
what's going through your mind at that stage?
So I think the biggest thing with separation is obviously it is a really emotional time for both parties involved. And so, anything to do with property and money, if you can kind of make it as easy for the partner as possible, that's a really important step to take, because this could be someone that you've been with for a number of years and you want to potentially have an ongoing relationship with this person, even if it's not a romantic one, and you've got to be respectful through that whole process, and both parties can feel like they're getting the raw end of the stick, especially if there is a difference in incomes or something like that, so there is going to be a change in lifestyle. I think the best piece of advice that I can give anyone getting into a relationship where there's going to be property or money involved is start with the end in mind. And I know that seems a bit, cold, but just have those things documented, because it's funny. I think back to the first girl that I ever invested with, Alice Stewart, in case she's listening. And I remember when we separated, there was a difference in the amount of money that we were paid out. Now, the difference came from the fact that we split the profits 50-50, and we both took our deposits back. Now, my deposit was more, so therefore I got a higher amount. Now, Alice is a very reasonable person, very intelligent girl. That's why she moved on. And she
hasn't looked back.
I remember she emailed me and said, hey, I'm just a little bit annoyed. You took more money out. It was meant to be even. And despite her being so reasonable, just because there was emotions involved, that was clouding the fact that actually this was completely fair, and if we'd looked at it based on the amount of risk that we put into it, i.e. our deposits, I would have taken 2/3 of the profit and she would have taken 1/3. And so, you just kind of have these things in writing.
Let me ask you this. So was this in terms of capital gain? So let's say, and I'm going to use really simple numbers here. Let's say that you invested in a $100,000 property, you put in 60% of the deposit and she put in 40%. Did you take 60% of the capital gain, or did you split the capital gain?
I split the capital gains 50-50. And that's where I was explaining to her that I should, if we were actually looking at this at the fair way, I would have taken 60% because I had 60% of the risk. Now, I didn't want it to be that way. I believe that we put in 50-50 effort. We just had different money to begin with. And so it was the deposit that was throwing those numbers out. But it was quite hard for her to get her head around, purely because it was more of an emotive state that we were negotiating. I also want to add here that it's really important that if maybe you're feeling guilty about the separation, be careful not to give away too much. So one of the investors that's a long-term investor that I work with, really good guy, he separated from his wife, a long-term wife, and met another woman. Now, as a result, he felt really guilty about that. And when he went through the separation, the divvying up of the assets, was very generous. And I remember saying to him at one stage, just remember, it's your financial future as well. And he's probably lived to regret being so generous now. I mean, it's great that he was doing that, but you do have to try and be as businesslike as possible here, still showing respect.
If he was leaving feeling guilty from what you've described as well, no amount of money is going to buy his way out of that situation.
Oh, you sound like you should be on Dr. Phil.
Well, do you know what? As I was growing up, I always used to love watching Dr. Phil because what else was there to do in South Taranaki? So I loved good old Dr. Phil. Never got into Oprah. But if I had, I would have had much more to say on this particular episode. What I want to ask you about as well, Andrew, is about the rebuilding of equity, because essentially you've gone from potentially owning a few rental properties or owning quite a bit of property, depending on how far through your journey is. You're now 45, you've got some income, and you've got to rebuild that life again. So does your property investment strategy differ from what it otherwise would? Are we now having to buy more properties and more growth properties in order to build up to that financial future we need to get to?
So I guess, yes, you do need to probably take a more aggressive approach if your goal is still the same. And what I mean by that is if you want $100,000 a year to live on and you're not cutting that in half, despite the fact that your relationship's been cut in half, then yes, you need to be more aggressive and you probably need to buy properties on a more regular basis. Whether or not you buy growth or yield will depend a little bit on, you know, where you're at from a servicing perspective, how much you can afford to contribute. But yeah, you probably need to focus on a more aggressive approach because of the fact that you're taking a bit of a step back.
Well, certainly your goal's not going to be cut in half just because there's one less person there.
Yes.
Because generally there are shared costs, or when you have two people in a relationship, your costs don't go up twice as much because you're sharing a house or you're sharing cars or whatever it happens to be, or sharing hotel rooms if you're going on your retirement holidays.
That's what causes divorce, Ed.
What's that? Sharing bedrooms?
Yeah.
Well, don't I know that? That's why I've put measures in place, which we don't need to go to in this show. What are some ways that we get around this? Are we investing in cheaper areas then if we can't afford to invest in Auckland like we used to be able to?
Yeah, so that's obviously something that you need to consider. If your budget no longer allows you to look at those areas like Auckland, then you might need to consider places like Christchurch or Hamilton that are a little bit cheaper because of the fact that your budget is maybe reduced if your income has been affected by a separation. So that's just something to bear in mind. And again, you know, you might also need to get more yield properties to try and bring up your serviceability.
And does it also mean that perhaps we now need to focus more on our careers to increase our income so that we can invest and perhaps put ourselves in a better financial position?
Yeah, or go marry someone rich.
Fantastic. Let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you've got a topic idea that you'd like us to talk about on the show, give us a text. Our number is 5522. It'd be great to hear from you. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Epic Knight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And we're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.